resolutions, reservations, and revelations. The first we create, hoping to better ourselves. The second we experience when facing challenges, while the latter we find from curious and open investigation. How possible is this openness of investigation when our judgment is clouded, our impressions tainted, and our emotions heightened to the point of prejudicing our perspectives? In broader terms, we're talking about the concept of bias, conscious and unconscious. We all carry it, as many act on it as don't, and just as many are completely unaware of its potential impact. When overwhelming public knowledge is simply based on a motive bias and minimal fact, what is the potential consequence to anyone asked to adjudicate upon a lawful and just outcome? And although the thought may be that if we had all the facts, we could at least know all the story, where is the possibility to provide impartiality to anyone, anything, or any part of a legal process? Our resolve has been tested, the reserves of our morality explored, the revelations will continue to come as we continue with the death of Phil Walsh, here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome again, or indeed welcome back to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and it's wonderful to once again hear those dulcet tones of David Sobolov in our show's introduction, and as always to be joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Happy New Year, Daniel. Happy New Year, listeners. Thank you very much for joining us for 2022 in the continuation of Just Lawful.
Absolutely. Thank you as always, but so much, as Sean said, thank you for, coming along on that journey of our very first year of the Just Lawful project. Sean, fair to say, interesting, intriguing, wonderful year that we had?
Very much so. Incredibly professionally fulfilling, incredibly personally fulfilling. It was great to finally be able to give so many deserving people the platform they've needed for so long to tell their stories.
Any particular highlights you want to recap?
Oh, look, getting Julie Kelburn on the show, getting Steve on the show, getting Arman on the show, those interviews, just amazing. Go back and listen to them on iTunes and Spotify to be able to let all of you hear these people the way that I speak to them and to not have to filter things down to a newspaper story. It's just an absolute joy.
And as much as I know how much that means to you, nothing about tax avoiding ninjas or doomsday cults or anything of that nature, mate?
Well, I did get some interesting mail over Christmas from Fiji. Let's leave it at that.
Lovely. Finally got that email you were waiting for, is that right?
Oh, if only. If only.
That's it. Look, before we begin, obviously, a huge thank you to everyone listening last year and for coming back and jumping back on board with us this year. We couldn't thank you more. We had such a great year last year, as we said. If you haven't heard our previous episodes or you didn't hear last year and you're just jumping on, please, we would strongly recommend and greatly appreciate you going over to iTunes, Spotify, rate, review, do all those wonderful things. Catch up on the back catalogue. Hear some of the stuff that we covered last year, some of the amazing stories that were told. The opportunities we had to be part of that in certain ways, and certainly, catch up on the stories so far. As we know, and we'll get to that very shortly, we did leave you partway through a story or a series we were covering, and it's fair to say some of the feedback we had was, how dare you?
Yeah, you're very popular, aren't you? Your love of the cliffhangers made you incredibly popular.
Look, I think it's that concept of being love to hate the concept. So, and that's not unusual for me. I wear that badge pretty proudly. That's okay. It is interesting. We did receive some wonderful feedback about that, and we do want to sort of touch on some of that before we go too much further. We wanted to recap and thank some of the wonderful people who did sort of reach out to us and some of the messaging we received.
Yeah, look, things like this story, it's opened my eyes a lot more than before. Thanks again for covering it, guys. I have learnt so much from the way you've covered this story. It's just not fair that this is the last episode of 2021. Looking forward to the resumption in 2022. And this, Daniel, was the one that really got me, from a listener by the name of Julie Sutherland. And Julie said, "Thank you for educating us about justice in the law. As a totally blind person, I enjoy going and watching the courts with my support workers. But I don't always get all of what's going on. So this podcast series adds more meaning, and I'm looking forward to listening to what you have put together for the next year." That's part of all this. Educating people, letting people understand what's going on in the court process in ways that they may not have been able to access previously.
You know, I was constantly amazed through our first series and all of last year as we went through this process and this project of just, I guess, the ways and the manners in which this did reach people and what it, and the things that people took from that. And that message, that last one you just read out, I would never have appreciated or understood that this could be a different medium and avenue that someone in that situation could appreciate something they were already engaged and invested in such a different and unique way. That is something that I could never have predicted, and is just, it's really, really, I guess, gratifying and humbling to know that it's another avenue for them to enjoy what they do.
There are so many people that have reached out privately as well and said things about how we are able to enrich their understanding and increase their ability to empathize with what's going on in the courts. Even professionals that have approached me. You know, walking around Victoria Square, I've had people come up to me who work in the legal profession, saying, "I don't enjoy the show. I engage with the show."
Yeah.
And I'm very interested to continue engaging with it. And even when I don't agree with you and Daniel, even when I vociferously disagree with you and Daniel, I still think what you do is important.
And that is, you know, that's something we really were very deliberate about. And we spoke about this. And, you know, if you've listened to the previous episodes, you would know that we said, you may not agree with us, you may have a different point of opinion or view, or there may be a certain reason of you and your perspective and personal experience that means what we say doesn't necessarily resonate as truth for you. And that is great. That's okay. We welcome that because it gives you the opportunity to reach out to us, and we vociferously advocate for that because that gives us the opportunity to engage in a conversation, right? And the more we can have that conversation, the more we can understand each other's point of view and hopefully learn something different from each other. And maybe, I heard a great saying the other day, and I think you're going to love this, Sean. I'm not trying to prove my point. I'm trying to improve my point of view.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot.
And that for me is what it's about. I love the fact that I can have a difference of opinion with someone because I want to understand, how did you get to that opinion? The backstory of that is so intriguing because what don't I understand that you know that I don't, or vice versa? That's where I love that piece.
And that brings me to probably the most gratifying professional compliment that I've received about this show.
Sure.
I actually had a judge approach me and say, "After all the years of seeing you sitting in my courtroom, listening to me tell you how the law works, to now turn around and switch on the radio or the podcast once a week and listen to how you see the law working, to have you teach me things about the law, has been incredibly wonderful for me." This is a judge I've known for the better part of 20 years. That was so wonderfully rewarding to think that, you know, someone from the bench is listening to us and saying, this is how we're being viewed, this is how our decisions are being interpreted and interpolated, and I'm taking that back and gaining a better understanding of the community's understanding as a result.
Yeah. And it would be remiss to say, as you said, some of that wonderful recognition, we both still sit and shake our head a little bit in incredible humility as well as pride that we won an award last year. And that was something that we never went out and intended to angle towards. It was really such a great feeling to have that recognition, I guess, if you like, for the work we've done in the manner that we've done it as well. So, and I just want to read out, and this is from, of all people, Julie Kelburn. When she found out that we actually did win that award.
The lady without whom this show would not be possible. If we are the engine room, the beating heart of this show, then Julie is the soul of this show.
Yeah. She just simply said, "Absolutely awesome. I am thrilled for you guys. The hard work you face and treat with such compassion is a credit to you both. Super proud. Much love and peace to you, both you and your families. Forever grateful." Julie, we are obviously incredibly grateful for you for sharing your story and, you know, that of Jack, and coming in when we asked you to and trusting us with that as our very first series.
Literally mean it when I say the show would not have been possible without Julie Kelburn. So a debt of gratitude and love forever to that wonderful, wonderful woman.
Indeed. Look, it hasn't all been roses though, Sean.
You've made some friends. Your soapbox moment toward the end of last year certainly got a few people talking, some positive. One said, well done, another fantastic episode, and a special thanks to Daniel for his soapbox. Some things need to be said, and he nailed it. Someone else said, to use the words of BT, wowee, what an episode, and that was some soapbox. You made a few enemies along the way as well. One said, please stop with the lawyer replies, as I have been in prison for most of half my life and I have taken responsibility for my actions.
And look, as I said, all feedback is valid feedback. We love hearing it. Whether you agree with us or disagree, whether you expect us to agree or disagree with you, hey, it's all about having a conversation.
Well, some people don't want to have a conversation. You know, there are some people on social media who have said, sorry, I'm going to unfollow you all as you've become obsessed with this Cy Walsh thing. It's getting that much that it is sickening.
Well, look, all I can say to that is, as much as you need to tell us that you're no longer going to listen, we appreciate you advocating that to however many followers you may or may not have, you're still advertising us in one way or another. So thank you anyway. And look, hopefully, you know, whether it's the Cy Walsh case or the next series we take on, we may be able to reach you and perhaps our thoughts and ideas and concepts may align with what does pique your interest in our next series. So please, if you want to take a sabbatical, we understand. But
I want to bring this one up in particular, Daniel. Now, this is a serious one here. One listener said, I can't understand why this family, meaning the Walsh family, isn't entitled to some privacy instead of having every detail shared. It's a tragedy, not entertainment. Now, I answered this on the Facebook page, but to state the purpose at the start of this year, I agree completely. It is a tragedy. It's not entertainment. You may be entertained by the way we present this, but we are not here to entertain you. This is a story that is covered by so much bias, existing opinion, confusion, legal conflict, and incredible legislative complexity. We are not here to entertain you about the death of Phil Walsh.
No.
We are here to explain what happened and to try to increase some empathy around this situation for everyone involved. Because the reality of all this is, Cy Walsh is a human being. He is one day going to have to face the community again. And we want some understanding out there about what his case is actually about before that day happens.
And to that point, Sean, it does bring us right full circle back to kind of where we left off at the end of last year. And to that point, it's not entertainment. We do want you to come on that journey with us because we want to educate you on the entirety of that story. Not to break our arms, patting ourselves on the back. It was wonderful to relive that down memory lane. We are in a moment going to go back to where we left off from last year. As this case, as we know, the death of Phil Walsh and the point we left Cy was very intriguing. The police had just said they had found something else, a substance on site at the time of his arrest, and that's where we'll pick up in a moment.
The story in the Advertiser on December 11, 2015 started like this. Cy Walsh has pleaded not guilty by reason of mental incompetence to murdering his father, former Adelaide Crows coach Phil Walsh. The Adelaide Magistrates Court on Friday also heard that a particular drug had been located in Walsh's belongings at the time of his arrest. The discovery prompted prosecutors to ask for a longer than usual delay before Walsh appears in the Supreme Court, so the substance can be tested and identified by forensic science assay experts. Daniel, this was the metaphorical stone dropped in the pond. You've got to remember where we all were at this moment. I had all the knowledge of this case from those 7 photocopying paper boxes full of statements. The court had desperately pulled back on that to make sure nobody else had that knowledge. Everything seemed to be leaning toward the concept that Cy Walsh was mentally incompetent due to some form of mental illness. But the question of drugs, of the ayahuasca, of the consumption of illicit substances still lingered over the case. You may remember I said that if I had been asked to decide guilty or not guilty at that point, I would have had a lot of trouble with that information. To hear now that post-dating all that information that I'd already read, someone had conducted a further inquiry and now believed there was a drug in Cy's possession at the time Phil died, changes the game. completely.
Absolutely, because, I mean, we know that just prior and the whole way through, Cy had said, I'm not on anything, I haven't taken anything. We also know that at the time of his arrest, he said, hey, do I need to get my stomach pumped? So there was already conjecture there.
That's right.
Was he, and how do you at that point, I guess, figure, can we take him on his word to say, I haven't taken anything when, you don't want to lean on it, but precedent shows we don't know that that's entirely truthful, or can we believe that? And just saying, do you need your stomach pumped? And now we found a substance. So, look, had you asked me at that point based on just that, I would be erring down the side of going, well, it sounds a lot like, and there's evidence to show the likelihood is he probably was on something, did have something. What did this mean, I guess, from, as you said, the prosecution was asking for a longer than normal term to just determine all this, and there was a rock in the pond, as you say. How was this taken, I guess, in court? What way was this reflected? What was the outcome of that?
Everyone that was sitting in the courtroom, journalist and observer alike, was fairly stunned because, as I said, we thought we were leaning in a particular direction. You may remember the magistrate said, let's have a press conference about how this should be dealt with and talk about the fact that there are these mental health issues, and the prosecution was very reluctant to do so. The reason being, I'll quote Prosecutor Lucy Board right here, "It has come to our attention that there is a particular drug that has been located in his belongings at the time of his arrest.
Yep.
Forensic Science SA is testing for it now, and we intend to put all that fresh information before the Supreme Court." Let's look at what we know about the way Section 269 cases work. If both sides agree that a person is mentally incompetent at the time of an offence being committed, it goes to the Supreme Court. A trial is held on the objective elements, the physical actions that would have been a crime had someone had the mental capacity to commit a crime. A limiting term is set. If the prosecution refuses to concede that someone was mentally incompetent, there must be a trial on that person's mental competence. And that does happen before a jury. Think of the confusion you just had then.
Yeah, I'm just trying to weigh up all those elements and I guess mentally navigate my way through that.
That's what a jury would have to do.
Yeah.
We're going to ask a jury to actually sit down and figure out all of this stuff. We're going to present them with the 7 boxes of evidence that Sean's already read.
Yeah.
And everything else that's come up since then, including the discovery of this drug in his possessions.
Yeah.
And say, what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Is he mentally incompetent or is he not?
Yeah, and as I said, I'm trying to mentally navigate that landscape and on the elements as they are presented in that sense. I would class myself as just the average punter on the street, being asked to come and sit in to listen to this evidence, and being asked, do you think there was, is it a mental incompetent situation or is it a drug-induced situation? I would be challenged thinking, why or who am I to, I guess, suppose someone's mental competence, whether you tell me that or not, unless you have a psychiatrist in there or a psychologist that can run me through that and they give their impression.
Which of course
happens. I understand. But even so, I don't have that knowledge, understanding, education, experience in that space. I would be incredibly challenged to confidently within myself go, I would absolutely be happy to go guilty, not guilty. This is the case. That would be, for me, incredibly challenging. And I would think for a lot of people put in that situation.
So that's where we are on December 11, 2015.
Yeah.
We're on this knife's edge because the prosecution's asked for more time. It's going to appear in the Supreme Court in February.
Okay.
So we've got the Christmas break in there, which always slows things down, especially for forensic science.
Sure.
The hardest working and most overworked department in all of South Australian forensic crime, just quietly. The amount of work they have to do is unimaginable. They work so very hard. So we've got this long delay.
Can I ask you a quick question just in
Sure.
there as well? Because we've now said we've found a substance. Now, we know that we originally sent away a hair sample.
That's right.
But that wasn't necessarily looking for what we think we now have found.
That was looking for anything.
Correct, anything. So is that...
Including medically prescribed drugs.
Right. So is that sample still used to then search for this, or do we need to form another sample? Did we understand the process of how that might work, or how does that look?
So once you've had a forensic sample taken, if you want a forensic sample taken from an alleged offender again, you have to get a court order to do so.
Yeah.
No court order was ever sought.
Okay.
So to my understanding,
It was the same.
it's all coming from the one thing.
And I was just wondering, because I know that then if we're now specifically looking for this now substance that we think we've identified, are we able to use the same sample to search for that at the same time?
Absolutely.
Cool.
There's also the fact that you've got to remember in all of those documents, there's all this discussion about ayahuasca,
Correct.
hallucinogens, etc.
Absolutely.
Imagine if you, and this is slight speculation here on my part, imagine if you're a police officer and you find a little sealable tub with some brown muck in it.
Yeah.
You don't know what it is. You don't think anything of it. You think, why is he carrying this around? Later on, someone gives you a statement and explains what ayahuasca looks like, smells like, feels like, tastes like, and you go, wait a minute, I remember that stuff. It was in his
Let's
pants
go back
pocket.
and find that.
Let's go back and do that.
Yeah.
This is why
Sure.
investigations take the time they
Of course.
do. This is why letting a certain journalist read all these documents months in advance probably wasn't the smartest idea for a court.
Yeah, possibly not.
You know, again, had I pushed the button on all
And
those
that's
stories,
right. Yeah.
we could have been in a very, very different situation.
And we know that it was an ethical decision on your behalf not to do that. So if we know that December 11th, you said, this
That's
is
right,
where we're at on that knife's
2015.
edge, we now know that we're due, I think you said, was it April you said we're set for the Supreme Court?
February for the
Sorry,
Supreme Court.
February. So it's 3 months delay there. What happens at this point?
Well, before we get there,
Okay.
we've got to talk about one more thing, and that's the media.
Right, okay.
Because again, I've got that knowledge.
Yes.
All of you listeners have that knowledge because you're in my head, so to speak. The rest of the media doesn't know.
Yeah.
They don't understand the significance of a particular drug has been located,
Okay.
what that means. So, of course, what do? They challenge the suppression orders again.
Right, okay.
Section 69A of the Evidence Act gives the media the right to jump up and challenge the suppression orders every single time. These are the suppression orders that had to be imposed because Channel 7 breached the conditions last
Sure.
time. They want them lifted. They say the orders should lapse on the conclusion of Walsh's first Supreme Court appearance.
Right.
So the automatic order that's placed in the magistrate's court doesn't continue on forever.
Okay.
It needs to fall away as soon as a new court's looking at it, saying the higher jurisdiction, meaning the Supreme Court, would be best placed to assess what should and should not be made public at that time.
Okay.
Nothing's going to change in December, but come February, can we have a new umpire, please?
Right.
New goalie, new decision.
Yep.
The magistrate's court agreed.
Okay.
They actually put what's called a sunset clause,
Right.
and they said at 5 p.m. in February, after the day of the hearing, this suppression order will evaporate.
Right.
And if the Supreme Court hasn't chosen to put a new one down, it's all carte blanche.
Right. Obviously, that means in between December and February, we still can't say anything.
Still can't say
Mum's
anything.
still the word.
But it also means those articles that I'm writing, remember I sat there and
Yeah,
spent
that's
days
right.
writing? I now know when I have to have them ready for.
Sure.
The earliest I could possibly use those
Yeah.
is going to be February.
Right.
So they need to be ready, locked and loaded,
Yep.
all set up. So we're all going away for Christmas that year, those of us that are covering the Cy Walsh case, knowing that one way or another, something's going to spring in February.
Quick question.
Yeah.
At that point, when the rest of the media jumps up and challenges that suppression order, and this again is probably pure speculation and probably hyperbole on my behalf, was it looked at as quite odd that the one person who is very usually generally the first to jump up and do that was sitting there calmly, i.e. one Sean Fuster, not challenging the suppression order?
Look, I'm a little more astute than that. I stood up and said that the advertiser supports the application for a sunset clause.
Were you champing at the bit and championing that cause, or just casually standing as a conscientious bystander in support?
I was fairly chill. It was a relaxed kind of stand-up and a slow kind of application. Certainly not with my usual fervour and vigour. Yeah.
And look, for those of you playing at home that might be understanding what I'm saying, in those moments, and I've seen it happen, Sean is usually the very first one jumping up and challenging suppression orders at that point to make sure that what should be, I guess, made public for the right reason, the public interest, is made available. In this case, as Sean said, he had that information. He had those stories that were being written. The rest of the media didn't have that knowledge or understanding at this stage. Hence, they would have been the ones absolutely jumping up to do that. I just think it would have looked quite odd that Sean wasn't the first one jumping up and probably looked a little out of place.
But it's not because I had the information
Yeah,
that I was slow on the jump.
sure.
But it is because I had the information that I was slow on the jump. It's not because I had it ready to go, I don't care, I'll publish and win whenever.
That's right.
It's because I'd read it.
Yeah.
And because I'd read it, and because I had that feeling of being in a room I didn't belong in, I didn't want this out there, especially with the potential for there to be a trial.
That's right.
If I can't come to a settled position in my own heart and mind,
Agreed.
and I reveal all of this information, how is anybody going to come to a settled position?
And that is the point we're about to explore. So we know that ethically you didn't push the button at the point. We also know that we're at a moment here. We now potentially have a date when that button can go live. We need to have a look at what happens in between there.
February 1st, 2016. Cy Walsh still faces a jury trial for the murder of his father, former Adelaide Crows coach Phil Walsh, because prosecutors have yet to concede he was mentally ill. That's what I wrote in the Advertiser. Walsh had faced the Supreme Court by video link, as prosecutors said they intended to investigate his claim of mental incompetence rather than simply accepting it.
Yeah, right.
We are headed for a trial.
So we're still, at this stage, the prosecution still is not willing to accept that mental incompetence. Therefore, off we go to court.
Also, it means that the suppression orders need to be talked about because, of course, we've got the sunset clause now.
That's right.
So Lucy Board, who is still handling the case for the prosecution, says we need a third expert opinion on Cy Walsh's mental state. Like the witness statements and the photos, it will deal with sensitive elements, and it's too soon for any of that to be made public. And I quote, "We've requested suppression of the contents of any witness statements and reports that have been tendered, both psychological and psychiatric. There may yet be a trial in this matter, and it would be prejudicial for that information to be published in these circumstances."
Which sort of furthers exactly what we were talking about and your ethical reason of not going ahead and publishing when you had the opportunity to do that. Because we know if we got to the point of having a trial, which now it looks like we are, then had you done that previously, and in this case, as Lucy said, if we release that now, that could prejudice that trial process.
So the court decided that they were going to let some information out.
Okay.
Because obviously the public interest was ravenous. So rather than, the mooted press conference, let's figure out a way to satisfy that public interest while also protecting the integrity of the trial.
Sure.
The Supreme Court allowed us to report the following. The prosecution case is built on more than 80 statements from Walsh's family and friends, both in Adelaide and interstate. Other witnesses include university staff, counsellors, police officers, pathologists, and past and present players for both the Adelaide and Port Adelaide football clubs. The case also involves CCTV footage and photos, including pictures of the crime scene. One mental health expert has already assessed Walsh and written a report on behalf of defence counsel, while a second is being prepared. If that sounds like the barest skeleton of what you've learned over the most recent episodes of this show, that's because that's exactly what it was. That's me telling you as much as I can about what I've read without dipping my toe into any of those boxes. I'm just rereading what I've written here. Just the fact that I said university staff.
Well,
Right there, that's the university staff for the Jesus pose, the you're scaring me, the blocking the door moment.
Sure.
Past and present players for both the Adelaide and Port Adelaide football clubs. We know who those players are.
Yeah.
I can't say who they are.
Yeah.
This is me very much trying to draw you the thinnest crayon outline.
Yeah, right.
And say, stuff's in here, folks, but I don't want to go any further than that.
We're talking about very broad strokes with absolutely no specificity of what those strokes entail.
That's right.
Yeah,
All
right.
because we are now facing a jury trial. We're not just facing a jury trial. We're facing a jury trial about mental health involving a murder, allegedly, involving an incredibly famous person. So I think what we need to do now, Daniel, is we need to talk about whether or not that could practically be done.
Expand on that. When you say that could practically be done, because I get what you're saying about those concepts, those elements coming together of the fame, the crime, or the alleged crime that's happened here. talk to me about what you mean by, well, how could this happen? We're going to trial. Well, that's a simple process. We move into a trial process and we get our arguments 2 and 4 and we sit in front of a judge and tell our story. What do you mean?
Okay, so how do you get together 12 unbiased people to hear this case?
Well, there's a jury process.
Yeah.
So we would get those people in and for my benefit, and I know a little bit about it, but not necessarily, what's the jury process as such? Here in Australia, how do we do it? Because I know that it is different to the Hollywood version that we see in all the wonderful lawyer, back and forth, and we see that in the courtroom. I know it's a different process to that.
Yeah.
Here in Australia, or here in South Australia specifically, what's our jury court selection process?
So if you're used to the movie process, you're used to the idea of counsel basically interrogating a pool of potential jurors, figuring out what their biases are, what they believe in, what they don't believe in. Let's call it the grand jury system for a moment, because it's very much that US grand jury style. In South Australia, you get a letter in the mail to tell you to come for jury duty.
Okay.
You then get sat in a courtroom in the public gallery. You have a number, like a chook raffle.
Yep.
If your number's called, you stand up and you walk to the jury box. Prosecution and defence will have your name, your age, your suburb, and your occupation.
And clearly your appearance.
Well, literally looking
That's
at
what I'm saying.
That's
So
right.
and obviously they can see what you look like.
They have 3 challenges.
Okay.
So between the time you stand up in the public gallery
Yes.
and the time you sit down in the jury box, they have to say the word challenge.
Okay.
If they say the word challenge, you turn around, you sit back down.
So it's not as if you go there, you walk over, they get to watch you, you sit down, they ask you something. They literally have to challenge you before any of that could even potentially happen.
They have to form a prima facie
Okay.
opinion of you, literally on the face of you.
Yeah, right.
How you look and what the little information they have about you tells them.
Okay.
And they can only challenge 3 people.
Each side. Okay.
So you're trying to create a jury of 12
Yeah.
with 3 challenges.
Yeah, right. Okay.
But you don't have any way of knowing whether these people are football fans or
Yeah.
not football fans.
Okay.
They could be Adelaide Crows season holders.
Sure.
You're not going to know.
Yep.
And they have no obligation to tell you, because a juror may identify themselves to the court beforehand and say, I don't think I can sit on this case because I have trauma in my past, or I've been through a similar situation, I think I know a witness, something like that. Jurors will be given, before the challenge situation, a list of these are the names of the witnesses in this trial.
Okay.
They'll be given an idea of what the trial's about.
Sure.
That gives them an opportunity to disqualify themselves.
Okay.
But nobody's going to disqualify them. Nobody's going to
right.
look through and say, Daniel Panozzo, this is a Collingwood player giving evidence. You're a Collingwood fan. You're out.
Right.
Nobody's going to say, Sean Fuster, you know nothing about the sports ball. You're perfect for this. Sit down.
Yeah, right.
Just to give a complete comparison.
Yeah, okay. So that kind of puts some more context to, I guess, my question before as to when you say, how do we put this together, that gives more context, because do you have, I guess, for want of a better term, some sort of connection or interest in this situation or relationship to whatever's happened, as opposed to then, are you completely outside of that, have no information? But again, as you said, then layer over the top, had you or any other media outlet gone forward with the information, how on earth do you get that? So now, with the high profile that we have...
Well, that's the micro.
Yeah, okay.
Let's take one step further out again.
Okay.
Adelaide is a 2-tribe town.
Sure.
You're Port or you're the Crows.
Yeah.
Phil Walsh worked for both.
Correct.
How do you find an unbiased football fan
Well,
amongst your potential jurors?
and that's what I was going to say. And I would go even the extension beyond that of, let's face it, even if you weren't a football fan, Adelaide itself is such a football dense population in terms of the coverage and the amount and the importance of it, that even beyond a football fan, everyone here knows who Phil Walsh is. If they didn't know who Phil Walsh was before as a coach for either team, they by certainly within the time of the incident to now have heard of Phil Walsh, the Crows coach, has been killed.
Yep.
They've absolutely certainly heard that within any walk of media, print, radio, TV, whatever that might be. They've certainly heard of that from now. So I get what you're saying, and now I understand by extension, even out beyond the football fan.
I'm not done.
Within this state.
I'm not done.
Okay.
Let's iris it a little bit further.
Sure.
You grew up in the era before the AFL was actually part of the South Australian vernacular, right?
Yeah,
you grew up
okay.
in the SANFL era.
Yeah, yep.
But Collingwood was your team
Sure.
in the VFL.
Mm-hmm.
how many people in South Australia had Geelong as one of their VFL teams?
Sure.
Oh, wait. Phil Walsh was part of the fabric of Geelong as well.
Yeah, and Collingwood.
And Collingwood as well. All right, well, maybe we should look for jurors outside of South Australia. There is potential within the legislation to do something like that. It's very, very rare, but let's try for that.
So
wait a minute. How do we do that?
Sounds like we veto Victoria then, if that's the case.
Now we've got to veto Western Australia as well.
Of course, for being part of the Eagles, and I'm going to make the jump here to say probably Queensland's out because obviously we're up there, the Brisbane Bears as well.
Some of the players might have come from there that are going to be potential witnesses. You see the problem that we're getting, and we haven't even gotten past the fact that we're talking about a football trial. Now let's bring in mental health.
Yeah.
How many weeks have we spent explaining mental health law in South Australia to people? How incredibly complicated is that to understand? How do you know you're going to get 12 jurors who can do this? How do you know you're going to get 12 jurors where one of them hasn't had some kind of brush with mental health in their lives, be it personally or with a family member?
How do you find someone, and 12 people in that instance, I suppose, that understand and are not affected and don't have their own experience with mental health and are not attached to football in some way? Yeah, okay, this is becoming quite the hectic sort of situation to try and put this together.
And the final hammer, under South Australian law, a verdict in murder must be unanimous. So find me 12 people that will all agree on guilty. Otherwise, it's going to be an automatic not guilty by virtue of a lack of a unanimous verdict.
Okay. All right. So while my head plays mental gymnastics here, let's just go and recap that. So we're at the point of needing to put a jury together for a trial. We need to find 12 people, impartial, unbiased, unattached, that haven't disqualified themselves, that we don't take one of our three challenges to, by the time they stand up, walk over and sit down, we haven't ruled them out, that hopefully aren't challenged by their own or some instance of mental illness that they can put aside. They're not a football fan. They haven't heard the coverage in whatever medium around this so far. And on top of that, we then need to put forward the prosecution defense arguments. And at the end of all that, from a prosecution perspective, because we're not going to accept the idea of mental incompetence, we need to convince all 12 of these people to say, yes, we agree it was a murder and guilty.
Exactly.
Anyone else out there feeling a little bit sort of overwhelmed by trying to follow that through? Because if you didn't understand before, and I'll be honest, I certainly probably didn't understand probably half of the depth of that until we laid this out. What a process to try and put that together. What a process for either of those sides to try and understand that argument. Okay, so we're putting together a jury for this. Goodness me, how do we go from here?
In case anyone out there thinks we're making too much of this whole jury selection process, juries are impaneled every day. There's got to be ways and means of dealing with this. Let's talk to the experts. Craig Caldecott, one of the best defence lawyers in South Australia. Everyone's got an opinion. In a case like this, you run into all sorts of problems because of that. They could be impartial. They could have uninformed opinions, be members of the Crows fan club, or have deeply held views about people with a mental illness. These are difficulties you can't counteract at all because the jury selection process doesn't allow you any means to do so. Social researcher Mark McCrindle. This case has the potential to affect the minds and the moods of not only jurors but everyone in South Australia. Lawyers and judges are experts at separating emotion and bias from logical information and being clinical and forensic, but the average Australian is not. When it's about sport, beloved personalities, and is happening in a two-team city, that heightens the challenges about keeping unbiased, especially as footy season rolls around.
Yep, couldn't argue with either of those points, and so that the point you started off with, if anyone is thinking we're making too much of this, I hope my deluded ramblings of trying to mentally, jump over those obstacles to understand that process, I hope that highlights just the process, and not just any case. And I recognise in any case it's a process, and you go through the same steps. The level, the exposure, the publicity that this has because of who it was, just takes that to another level and makes it so much more difficult.
And what's upsetting in all of this is we are losing the people in this discussion.
Yeah.
This is ceasing to be about Cy Walsh, the
Yes.
individual, Phil Walsh, the individual, Meredith Walsh, the bereaved individual.
Yeah.
This is suddenly about a mental health case, a famous person, a complex situation. We've gone so macro again that we've lost, just like in our very first episode where we stripped away the names and talked
correct.
about the incident.
Yeah.
We've lost everything again. The case has been sacrificed to the greater context.
There is one piece in this that we have and we are guilty of continuing to talk about, which in essence has absolutely nothing to do with this on any level, and yet is one of the most instrumental, influential, incremental pieces of this. This has nothing to do with football.
Nothing at all.
Absolutely nothing to do with AFL, and yet every single episode, you and I are just as guilty of having to talk about the influence and the impact because of that connection.
That's right.
Because this sort of thing, whether we like it or not, unfortunately happens in every walk of life, in any community that has nothing to do with AFL. The same sorts of things are occurring in our own backyards, in our community at large, and yet we continue to have to bring in the concept of the AFL. We cannot just focus on this case and the elements and the evidence too for the arguments of mental incompetence, of drug use, of family dynamics, of a horrible situation that caused a death without bringing in the concept of the AFL.
And yet we are not the only people, as you said, because the coverage at the time, the tone at the time, the tenor at the time was very much influenced by what you've been calling that our coach feeling.
Of course. And it is. And whether we like it or not, and even at the time, I didn't have a connection to Phil Walsh or the Walsh family, or to be perfectly honest, not to the Crows or Port Power. Port Power were kind of my second team. Beyond that, I just knew that was a tragedy of a man losing his life, his son, and he was the Crows coach at the time. However, I also know so many people I personally knew were just devastated that our coach, and I don't mean to downplay that or trivialize that or make light of that, but that was the feeling at the time. To that point, Sean, I want to just, if I can, read out some commentary. Like, this is social media commentary of the layperson, the person in the street like myself.
The potential juror.
The potential juror is exactly right. The person that we are going to ask to be one of those 12 people who are unbiased, unconnected, able to look at this very down the line, matter of fact, and come up with a decision. Some of this is a little, in hindsight, hard to, I guess, it's uncomfortable. I'll be honest with you. It's a little awkward, uncomfortable to read and hear. It's the feeling of the day. It's a temperature check, if you like. It's a pulse check on how the wider community was feeling. Wow, that's a load of rubbish. The legal system is incompetent. Self-inflicted incompetence, no excuse. No surprise there, it was on the cards. Drugs or not, he killed his father with such hatred. What a fake. Hope the judge and jury don't believe him, incarcerate him for the rest of his life in a mental hospital, then he will go mental living with mental prisoners. What a shame we no longer have the death sentence.
Yeah.
He was on drugs, watch the creep walk. And this one. What a cop-out. Being on drugs is no excuse. He murdered his dad and he should go for no less than murder. Not guilty. What a load of crap. The bottom line is he walked through the front door and brutally murdered his dad and walked away.
Which I can't even begin to say how wrong that is, just on what we know to this point, to February 5th, 2016, just how wrong that is.
And I said in the opening of this, if we had all the facts, we'd have all the story. Would that sway this opinion or impression or perspective? Don't know. However, this is the temperature check of what the person on the street was feeling about this at the time, the emotive response they were giving, because they were only working with the facts they had, the half-truths, the myths, the ideas, and they didn't have access to 7 photocopying boxes of documentation. How we tried to get 12 jurors out of a situation like that is a very, very intriguing piece. If that's what we're dealing with, how on earth do we navigate that process?
I want to take you back to Craig Caldecott again. The court will be selecting jurors in an environment where people have pre-formed ideas and where the case has been played out in the media. Defense retains the right to argue their client is mentally incompetent even if the prosecution won't accept it. That means the jury will have to decide the issue based on complicated medical evidence and issues in the midst of a very high-profile case. What's the potential that a person who feels the same way as it's murder, he was on drugs, there's no excuse, he did it and he walked away, ends up as one of those 12?
The commentary I just took there, I did grab a random selection. However, that was one after the other. That was kind of the majority sentiment over most of the stuff I looked at. It's not like I've doctored just the bad. I haven't looked for the bad stuff. It's been the majority.
And I can attest to that because that was the tenor of the social media messages I was getting, the emails I was getting. A lot of journalists were getting attacked at the time for the way we were choosing to cover the case.
Yeah.
If we seemed to be too pro Cy Walsh, we were attacked. If we seemed to be too anti Cy Walsh, we were attacked. Everyone seemed to have a polarized opinion.
I made note of that a couple of episodes ago, and I won't repeat that, but you personally did have to wear a lot of that, and I know that. I saw and heard that, and I know in our conversation since, there was a lot of personal attack on yourself about that, and predominantly about the fact that people felt you were way too pro Cy Walsh, and you weren't as up in arms, should I say, as a lot of other people were toward the fact that it was Phil Walsh. Phil Walsh was a victim in this, absolutely, and deserves the respect and empathy that everyone does in those situations. However, it's not as black and white as that.
That's right. And the fact that I wasn't a football fan and that was known was very much used as a brickbat against me in that period.
Fair, unfair, whatever it is, I guess it comes with the territory, Sean.
Well, look, I don't care about that from my perspective. You know, these shoulders aren't for show. I can deal with that sort of thing. My point about raising all this is, if someone's willing to come at a journalist and say those things, what kind of preconceived notions are they taking into the jury pool? Yeah. And how is a judge, a jury, how is Cy supposed to look around and say, I will get a fair hearing here? How is Meredith supposed to sit there and say, my son will get a fair hearing here for the death of my husband?
Yeah.
It's so fraught for her already, let alone leaving your son's fate in the hands of people that are, you know, burning him in effigy outside the doors of the courthouse because they loved your husband. I mean, how do you reconcile that?
I don't think it's possible to at that stage. My question is, if we know that and we're in this process, what's the next step? Where do we go from here?
So where we go from here is a very, very, very long break. This is, you know, February. We're taking a break until August right now.
Yeah.
And again, we have to talk about football.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that was being mentioned at the time was, well, the Crows are having a really good season this year. You know, come August time, they were sitting third on the ladder.
Yeah.
And we're about to have more hearings. You know, Cy Walsh might be going to trial as the grand final season starts up.
Yeah.
And the Crows are third on the ladder. Really, should we be looking at putting this off until next year? I mean, come on. Honestly. Look, no. Honestly, anybody out there that's saying, well, Sean, no, not well, Sean, come on. This is the fate of a human being over the death of another human being. You're asking the process of justice to stop for a sporting competition? I'm sorry, I can't countenance that. You can't run a society that way.
And yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Well, and the court is actually listening to this. This is the thing. And I'll tell a bit of a sideline story here. During the jury deliberation period for the bodies in the barrel murders, you know, Australia's worst ever serial killings, the deliberation period went for 11 days. It went over grand final weekend. Justice Brian Martin suspended deliberations, had a television rolled into the courtroom, let the jury watch the entire grand final, and then sent them back to their deliberations and had the television rolled out again, because His Honour knew that there was no one in that jury room that was going to be concentrating on the job at hand because they'd all be wondering about the grand final score. Such is the magnetic pull and power of football over this country, over this state, that it even infects the courtroom.
It's almost bewildering to understand how much that impact and power it actually has.
And that's why you've got the position of, oh, well, you know, we'll come back in August and we'll figure out a trial date then. Has somebody got a copy of the AFL fixture and the ladder, please? Because we're going to need that too.
And with that, to understand how that would play out, and would this truly have the impact that it potentially might on the AFL final series, we'll pick that up in our next episode. Until then, as always, once again this year, thank you so much for coming back. First episode of this year, this continuation of this story. Thank you so much. If you haven't already, please jump over to iTunes, Spotify, rate, review, subscribe, do all those wonderful things. Otherwise, if you've heard the broadcast here on 5AA, thank you for being a listener. As always, if you want to get in contact with us, give us some feedback on your feedback from this episode. You can do that at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. You can, of course, follow Sean and all of Adelaide's True Crime on both Facebook and Twitter at Sean Fuster. And as always, welcome back. Enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.